Okay, I'm taking you to my secret spot today because today is a very special day. Why is it really special? Because I have some liver pate right here that Judi had made. And I have some egg yolk crepes. And why do I show you this? Because I'm exploring the whole topic of uric acid. And right now, this is a Paleolithic meal. I'm not saying I always eat Paleolithic, it just happens to be both of these things. This is organ meat, let's be clear. This is beef, not calf, liver pate. We've, Judi cooked them up, blended them up. I love it. Put some onions in and spices and so nice. And these are egg yolk crepes. They can be waffles or anything. This is my snack. I just love this. So you're gonna watch me get these things together. I'm gonna get out a spoon. And I'm going to tell you why I'm doing this in just a second. It's real straightforward. I eat like a slob, not always, but I'm going to do that now since that's the only way I can figure out how to do it. And I spread the pate in the crepe. It's not really a crepe, I call it a crepe. For those who know crepes, this is definitely not a crepe. And this is wonderful. This is my high choline, high whatever. It is just so, so good. Yet, I told you I had gout a couple times, and yet why am I eating organ meats? My gosh, I shouldn't be eating this, right? According to that. But the whole point of today's podcast is that I'm going to show you, at least start to show you, that gout and elevated uric acid is nearly and entirely an inside job. In other words, inside, this is outside. My diet of delicious organ meats really has almost nothing to do. If I was really close in all the other things we're going to talk about, and I had this, maybe it would put me over to too much, elevate my uric acid to the point that it's a problem. But really, it's not an issue. I don't have it every day. I'm lucky if I have it once a month. It's probably once every 6 weeks that I have a whole bowl of this, and it doesn't last very long. Okay, so what I want you to remember is that we've talked about the 3 phases of gout increasing since the Paleolithic time, right? Oh, another bite coming up. So the 3 phases. So we had Paleolithic 25 million years ago, and then we had the agricultural revolution, which was 10,000 years ago, and the Fertile Crescent and the cradle of civilization and all that, and how sugar arrived to the Middle East really 600 to 800 AD. So what happened from the beginning? Phase 1 was from the beginning of agriculture. So we're saying that's 10,000 years ago, and animal domestication. And going forward, all the way up, let's call it 1000 AD to be simple about it, right? So what did they eat? Well, they had gradually more and more domesticated animals. So they had the pigs, they had the sheep, they had the goats. Cattle came from India, and pigs were semi-local. So that was it. What they didn't have, they didn't have any fructose. Really, any fructose. It would be in honey, wherever they could find that. That would be an extreme treat. Maybe they had some berries around, maybe some fruits. Fruits were pretty primitive back then. So if you were reading the Bible, for instance, nobody was having a salad. They didn't all get around and have a salad. They're always talking about breaking bread together, because what they had was grains. They had grains. So grains are starches, okay? So starches are broken down to glucose only. Starches, so for 10,000 years, for the most part, they had starches. They had all sorts of breads. Maybe they can make whatever they called a cake back then. They had plenty of alcohol. We've been through the whole alcohol thing. So that's the setting for phase 1. The worst thing that could cause elevated uric acid, so we're using gout because we don't know about uric acid back then, was alcohol. And how alcohol is broken down in the body. The liver ends up making fructose. I skipped 15 steps, but I'll get into that later in the video portion of this. It got into fructose. That's where our fructose came from. Alcohol as a side product of alcohol, of really too much alcohol. A little bit's not bad. As Paracelsus said, it's the dose that makes the poison. It's the amount that you have, not the thing that you have. Low doses of everything you can pretty much tolerate. When the dose gets too big for your ability to break it down, to metabolize it, it becomes a problem. So here we are now. We are strictly on a diet of carbs, yes, but the carbs are starches. There really is very little in the way of leafy green vegetables. That was no proof of that, actually. It was starches, it was bread, matzah, if you will, flatbread, and so on. And that was it for certainly a number of thousands of years. And then they learned to ferment grains, which beer came along. All sorts of beer. We showed you how 5,000 years ago, how many different kinds of beer did they have in Egypt? All through the Mediterranean, beer was the thing. And actually it was, even went beyond that. The Muslims, Islam brought it into distilled liquors, but that was again about 1000 AD. So we had wine, that was about 7,000 years ago. So plenty of alcohol was flowing and starches. Alcohol and starches. So the only source for fructose, other than that dietary fructose, sometimes honey, if they have that at all, which is probably not much for the average person, maybe some fruit, not much for the average person. But it was their alcohol consumption was, when it was metabolized by the liver to make it so it's not toxic, created fructose. Fructose then was either metabolized into glucose, because that was a possibility. We've talked about that, right? So here you go. We had that pathway of, if we have too much glucose, we ate too much breads, too much carbs, only glucose, only glucose. Well, there was a relief valve. There was a pressure valve that could convert that to fructose, to get the glucose out of the bloodstream, right? Because if glucose went too high, then insulin came in, and if it kept on being too high, then insulin got higher, and you get what they call insulin sensitivity. But the escape valve was, it can be converted to fructose, and from fructose, it can go off and be made into fat. It was like a one-way street if things got to be too much. So when the dose of carbs going to glucose got too much, it went over to fructose. Okay, good enough. So this is what we looked at before, all the different phases. Phase 1 was about grains 10,000 years ago until 1,000 years ago. Grains and everything that came from grains. We're going to go into it briefly in a second. So I call the 700 to 900 years AD the sugar line. Call it 1,000 years. It depends where you were. Were you in the Middle East? Were you in Southern Mediterranean? Were you in Scandinavia and England? It varies. So we're calling it 1,000 years for the sugar line. Sugar being from cane sugar. Okay? And then later we're going to discuss phase 3, where things really go nuts. Here's phase 3, right around 1950. Evolution of increasing uric acid levels. That's what this is all about. We're using gout as a proxy, as a substitute, because obviously we didn't know about uric acid 5,000 years ago. Okay, first phase was grains, starches, and alcohols, and organ meats from the preceding era of Paleolithic. All that came from hyperuricemia, elevated uric acid, gout, dementia, cardiogenic, metabolic, obesity, diabetes, etc. 10,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago. Here we see that first documented case that we know of, verified 5,000 years ago, 2640 BC, was in Egypt. We talked before about in Egypt how many different kinds of beers they had. And we know that beer came on the scene 13,000 years ago. So this was 5,000 years ago, was roughly 8,000 years after beer was discovered. So 8,000 years of making it a better and better process. How many different kinds of beers do you think they had? Plenty. Probably at rivals today. Hippocrates in Greece, 400 BC. Plenty. That's where medicine first got to documenting what gout looked like and a lot of other similar situations. Alexander the Great in Persia. He died at 28, so he had gout at a very early age. Charlemagne, we're missing William the Conqueror, we'll get to him, and Henry VIII, and then the Founding Fathers, etc. Okay, so phase 1 is all about this. We're looking at a pathway in us. So I'm trying to bring you from history to food to biochemistry pathway. And this is all about glucose, okay? All about glucose that comes from grains. That's all we have is glucose coming from grains. and it goes into this pathway. When it gets to be too much, it changes over to fructose. Two things that change this is elevated glucose levels and also concentration of salt. We'll get into the salt variable later in another video because it's really interesting. Just don't want to complicate it. But we're looking at glucose only as a trigger here for the glucose to shift over to the fructose. And the fructose gets converted to fat. It's a seasonal thing. It's a good thing. We get fat we eat our grains in the fall, we get fat for the winter, and we live off our fat for the winter and get ready for the next spring. Okay, so glucose and alcohol come from dietary grains. And you can add high omega-6. This is explaining the layers of evolution responsible for the exploding levels of hyperuricemia. And all the things that come from the obesity, the cardiogenic, the cerebrogenic, dementia, Alzheimer's, all these things gradually started way back then. The drumbeat has just gotten faster, and you'll see why. So alcohol, we talk a lot about alcohol. And by the way, I like alcohol. Alcohol goes into this same polyol pathway, but it comes in through a slightly different opening, through aldose reductase. Here we go. There's the summary of the sorbitol, the polyol pathway, converting everything to fructose and uric acid. Steatosis is fatty liver. Apoptosis is cell death. When it gets to be too much, you get liver damage, primarily fatty liver, from fructose, right? The fructose is being created for the glucose or the alcohol. So distilled spirits, people ask about, when did distilled spirits, when did whiskey show up, right? Well, we don't know exactly, but it's anywhere between 800 to 100 BC. So actually about just before the time of Caesar, if you will, 55 or so BC. So what does alcohol actually do, and that has anything to do with any of this? So many people feel this is a personal criticism of their alcohol use. And so here's somebody in the 1600s saying, I'm so not giving up my pint. It's all about choices, being informed in the choices. Alcohol basically can be processed by the liver in a healthy way. A lot comes down to how much are you having and what kind of alcohol are you having. All right, so alcohol comes in, goes through two enzymes to be converted to acetate. Acetate is vinegar. Vinegar is water soluble, goes out with the urine, gets excreted in other words. But we have a couple of factors here. Do we have the nutrients to make these things work? And do we have the correct genes to make these things work? But basically alcohol should be processed to be water soluble and to be excreted without a problem. If we have too much alcohol, when we get a hangover and everything else, well, we force it to go beyond this capacity. And that's assuming we have no problems. It goes beyond this capacity, and then it goes into the polyol pathway. It goes right in there, the aldose reductase. So now we've added another layer of fructose generation. We had the glucose from the grains and the starches going in the same pathway to make fructose, and the fructose goes into making fat and also the uric acid. And so the alcohol, when pushed, either by limited pathways here, can't do that, or we've simply had too much. Notice glutathione is here, a big player here. What I want to point out in the last 10 years and where I'm getting this research, this is a big patent race. Pharmaceutical companies are dying to come up with another drug to block aldose reductase. If their thinking is if they can block this, then they can block Alzheimer's, dementia, all the fat and type 2 diabetes, all the things that are subsequent to that fructose generation. If they can block all that, then they're home free. So they're working on that, and there's a lot of money being poured into finding a drug to block that enzyme. It's kind of simple thinking because you would think that the problem has been caused by the foods that we eat, but that's another story. But this is where I'm getting the research from this. And the fructose kinase is another enzyme here that converts the fructose to the fat, the triglyceride, and makes the uric acid. So you'd hit these hot spots and supposedly everything's good. I don't know if that's going to be the story or not, but that's where a lot of this research is coming from. So what happens to all of that endogenous fructose? All that fructose we created. We didn't eat any. It was not dietary. We created the fructose. Okay, well, the first thing we've had the alcohol, had the grains that forced that pathway, and the fructose gets converted to uric acid and gets converted to triglycerides and starts with fatty liver and fat. Okay, that's phase one. Phase one was this pathway, glucose only, and then alcohol. Okay, you got that. Glucose, sorbitol, fructose. We've talked about that a number of times so far. So these three alcohols, beer is the most offending. That is, it creates the most uric acid, and it has alcohol, which creates the endogenous fructose. Spirits are certainly the last chronologically to be discovered and manufactured and refined, but its issue is it's almost only alcohol. There's no purines in it, very clean alcohol, but it's very concentrated. That kind of hit creates a lot of fructose. And now's wine, not very high alcohol, but it has a lot of other things in it called polyphenols, which could be considered antioxidants, and they do a lot of other things. So in essence, it's the healthiest. Depending on the research you read, some say even wine is a problem. Others say wine's not a problem. Interesting thing is 13,000 years ago, beer was started. 7,000 year wine was started. You would think beer would be the more in-demand alcohol. Okay, so how to convert these standard drinks, just to compare, we talk about it. Theoretically, all alcohol drinks, right? If you had a 5%, we're going to look at a 3.5% beer, but a 12-ounce mug, pint of beer would be the same amount of alcohol as a glass of wine, is the same amount of alcohol as a martini. So that should all be equal. The difference is the concentration of the alcohol, obviously, and the other things that are with it, such as wine, and then in beer, it's purines. We're explaining why these layers of evolving grains to alcohol to sucrose is getting more and more complicated for the liver, making more and more endogenous fructose and driving it fast forward. You've seen this before, we end up with the same problem. Okay, so the three components in beer are purines. Primarily it's one purine, and that's guanine. Here's guanine right there. There's uric acid. This is generally what a purine looks like. It's a big ring, small ring, a six-sided ring and a five-sided ring. That's what is a purine. That's why they all have that same profile. Okay, but here in beer, from brewer's yeast specifically, you get guanine. So if it was baker's yeast, you wouldn't get that. If you would nutritional yeast, it's yeast. These are all yeast and they all have purines. But the worst is brewer's yeast, which you need for making beer, makes guanine because that's immediately converted into uric acid. Bang, bang, very fast. Sugar is in beer as well. I forgot to mention that before. Sugar, the maltose, is basically two glucoses tied together. We're going to talk about sucrose in a second, and that's glucose tied with fructose. This is maltose, two pieces of, it's a disaccharide, and it needs to be digested a little bit to free up that glucose to be used by the body. And then, of course, there's alcohol. Again, phase one is just about glucose, all that we can get from grains, and the fact that the fructose is made into fat. There's the big picture. These enzymes are so important that drug companies are looking to see if they can come up with it. Their hope is that they're going to be the next allopurinol. Allopurinol was actually down here in the 60s and blocked purines from being formed by actually making a purine-like formula. Not only did the guy who had the patent on that make a lot of money, it was actually a company and a guy, but the man who invented it got the Nobel Peace Prize. So they're in good company. They're going through the same idea. If they can get a drug to block aldose reductase or to block fructose kinase, not only will they make a lot of money, they might be up for the Nobel Prize in medicine or chemistry. Then what happened? 1000 AD, sugar. Sugar specifically, we have to say sucrose because sugar's used loosely, so sucrose is what showed up in the form of sugar cane, right? We talked about the Papua New Guinea to India to China and so on and so forth in the Middle East about 600 AD and then up to Scandinavia and Europe a couple hundred years later. But sucrose has that glucose and it came coupled with fructose. So now that was really the first bona fide high quantity, when it started to get popular, source of fructose. So now they had the glucose from all the starches, which was really all the preceding 7,000 or 8,000 years, right, since the agricultural revolution. Now they had more glucose that they loved and the fructose. So now the body's going, wait a minute, we got the alcohol that you guys are clever enough to figure out, and now we're having more fructose. Things are starting to fall apart. The frequency of gout, the drumbeat of gout and elevated uric acid is getting higher. It's a slow drumbeat at this point. So the first culprit was primarily excess alcohol coupled with enough carbs of the starches, which is glucose, right? So it piled on. And now sucrose came in, which was more glucose, and fructose. So that's why this whole thing is called fructose toxicity, or this whole theory of elevated uric acid, hyperuricemia, is based on fructose, because fructose really didn't exist until the sugarcane came along, until sucrose came along. And boy, did it come along. They loved it in China, they loved it in India, they loved it in the Middle East, and I told you about it, they made a whole mosque of sugar. That's how impressive it was. It was worth its weight in gold, literally. So that was phase two. Phase two was the alcohol making fructose. It was the sucrose coming 50-50 with fructose, getting to be too much. So in phase two, things changed significantly. We now have the grains and the alcohol and the glucose. We got all that down. Phase two, we're amping up. That beat, that drum beat gets a little more sophisticated. It gets a little more onerous. So this is where dietary fructose turns deadly, and all the things that it creates: gout, dementia, cardiometabolic, etc., etc. Obesity becomes more common. Phase one was all about grains, glucose, and alcohol, right? It would only addressed one half of this pathway, the polyol pathway. Only one half. It fed in at the glucose part. And it made fat, right? The seasonal fat. Got fat in the late fall because we ate all the grains or drank all the beer. Got fat for the winter, allowed us to survive to springtime. But now phase two is we're getting both ends. We're now adding more glucose, a lot more glucose, and we're adding fructose, and this is the first time that's ever happened. Dietary fructose. We're taking it, we're eating fructose. It was already a problem. The body was already converting glucose to fructose and then into fat. Now we're having fructose, and we have the same problem. So phase two was about increasing glucose amounts, but mostly about the dietary fructose from sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. Okay, adding more glucose to what we already had, plus fructose from all the grains, glucose, alcohol, purines from fermented starches. Oh, do we love the sucrose? You bet we do. Second phase, where dietary fructose turns deadly, sugar. We love it. Can't get enough of it. So here we are, phase one. Now we're up to the sugar line. The sugar line's taking us from 1,000 years ago, not that long ago, 1,000 years ago, up until about 1950. Oh my gosh, not even 1,000 years. Now we're going to get to the story of William the Conqueror, who was 400 years before Henry VIII. Let's get to it. Okay, here's when obesity came to the West. It kept on getting bigger. And in the ensuing 1,000 years since the sugar line, around year AD 1000, this contributed to more deaths than any war, any world war, any plague, and any pandemic. It was huge. It suddenly increased our disease rate, and dropped our immunity, made us ill. Talked about where it came from. 10,000 years ago, they have verification that it wasn't Papua New Guinea. 4,000 years ago, they're seeing it was being cultivated in China, 3,500 years BC, India, 100 BC, and then it came smacking right up to the Middle East in the Mediterranean around 800 AD. So I'm calling this the sugar line around 1000 because it didn't get to Scandinavia and England, didn't get to England until 1069, just after the Battle of Hastings in 1066 by William the Conqueror, who brought sugar to England. Okay, William the Conqueror, 1027 to 1087. So he lived basically 60 years. Won the Battle of Hastings, 1066, and all that, which made him King of England and France. Brought sugar to England in 1069, was the basis for the Game of Thrones, the HBO movie series, and he is the only ancestor of all the monarchs of England, up to and including Queen Elizabeth II, who died just recently. And he introduced beheading, for political opposition. They don't do that today, but they do other things, right? But wait, he became something of a legend for something else entirely. And that was, he was William the Obese. He was the first obese king in Europe, 400 years before Henry VIII, who everybody thinks about as this big gluttonous king. He might have been William the Conqueror, William the Obese. He grew immensely fat. William had one challenge he could never conquer, and that is of being extremely fat. He was constantly ridiculed for being a fat man and was said to be lying in, which means pregnant. So in the summer of 1087, the year he died, William went off to the ancient equivalent of a weight loss clinic in Rouen, France, where he planned to trim the pounds away with a strict diet of herbs and medication. He never made it, however. Along the way, he had to take care of some business, which was a small battle. He decided to retaliate against the invading French garrison at the border of Mantes. William won the battle, but he lost his life in the celebration of the battle. The celebration of the battle was all the sugar, all the ale, all the alcohol, all the things that made him even fatter and fatter. His death was caused, however, when the pommel of his saddle, that's the pommel of the saddle, was literally driven into his intestines because he was so big. He was too big for his saddle. The medical men at the time were not able to do anything for him. He lingered in immense pain for 6 weeks before he died. Oof, the story's not over. Upon his death, William's body proved to be too fat to fit in his stone sarcophagus. When the monks tried to force the issue, his swollen bowels burst. I know, it's a gross story. Filling the abbey with such a stench that everyone, apart from the officiating clergy, left. So, a little sympathy here. Can you imagine not knowing why you are so obese? And it was also new. Why am I so big? Why? He didn't know, he didn't associate it with the sugar. There wasn't any sort of awareness of that. He had no idea why he was so big. Somebody help him, was his thinking. But he was huge, and it was sucrose. Sucrose was a new addition to the elite's diet. Or was it a new addiction? This was the first time in evolution that dietary fructose, as part of sucrose, was available to so many, was consumed in increasing quantities and frequency. In fact, sugar was more valuable than gold. 1412, a traveler in Egypt wrote that a mosque was built of sugar. A mosque was built of sugar. Europeans would take these same ideas and customize them. Imagine that. What happens when it rained? I guess it didn't rain. Okay, obesity had already reached such a state in England now by the 1700s, now or after Henry VIII. They thought their country would soon be overrun with obesity. Overrun with obesity in the 1700s. And here's a graph. So here we go. It's all referenced. So from 1700s to 1770s, the average consumption of sugar per capita went from roughly 4 pounds to 16 pounds. 4 times increasing the amount of sugar in 70 years, in a lifetime. Here's a quote from that time. I believe no age did ever afford more instance of corpulency, obesity, than our own. Thomas Short. That's 1727, so he's down here. 1727, he's complaining of obesity. And now in 1816, which is off the scale here, for one fat person in France or in Spain, there are 100 in England. So England was just known for its sugar excesses. Okay, in 1704, sugar consumption was 4 pounds per person and changed to over 150 pounds per person to today. There you go, look at that. 37.5 times increase in over 200 years. Yo! And they thought it was bad in the 1700s, huh? William the Conqueror thought it was bad, period. Phase 3 starts here. Look at that. Look at the difference here. Get into that later. Okay, so the two causes that transformed sugar from being a cheap luxury, from a luxury to cheap commodity were, one, slavery. All of the Caribbean was developed and other areas developed by the English to manufacture sugar. Its universal consumption triggered an addiction to demand more of it. Okay, another way to reference this is in 1822, now we're in the colonies, right, the new country, that 1822, the average American ate the amount of sugar every 5 days equivalent to 1 can of Coke. 1 can of Coke every 5 days, every 5 days. In 2022, it's 1 can of Coke every 7 hours. That's a big increase. Here's the line from England in the 1770s. So it took the US a little while to catch up to where England already was at. So from the liver's perspective, these two sugars are not at all equal. Glucose, I should say, the amount of glucose that comes to the liver when you consume it is only 20% of whatever you consume, because the whole body needs glucose and can utilize glucose. However, fructose can only be consumed, broken down, processed by, metabolized by the liver. So 20% of all the glucose that you eat goes to the liver, 100% of all the fructose you eat goes to the liver. That's a big deal. That brings us to another comparison, similarities between soda and beer relative to the liver. All right, so we have a 12-ounce can of soda, Coca-Cola, let's say, a 12-ounce beer, we're using 3.6% alcohol, and this comes from a paper in 2013, a research paper by Dr. Lustig called Sugar is Alcohol Without the Fructose is Alcohol Without the Beer, 2013. So the calories, they're equal. So it's 50% fructose, 50% glucose. We're going to compare that. Beer is also 150 calories, ballpark. So alcohol, the liver has to handle 80% of all alcohol. Alcohol goes for the rest of the body, as we know. It has some purines, and it has maltose that has to be broken down to be available in glucose. Let's look at that. Okay, soda, the glucose, 20% of all the glucose goes to the liver. 20% of 25 calories of glucose, that equals 4 grams. So 4 grams of glucose to the liver. 100% of all the fructose, so that's 20 grams. Remember, we're talking about the work the liver has to do. We're not talking about calories. So we have, let's look at it another way. So we have that whole polyol pathway, 4 grams of glucose coming in, 20 grams of fructose coming in from both ends. It really amps up that whole pathway. We can expect it's all going to be converted into fat, right? And into uric acid. There we go, into liver fat, into uric acid. But the beer is a little bit different. The alcohol, 80% reaches the liver, so that's 13 grams of alcohol. That's standard for drinks. 13, 14 grams of alcohol is for a martini, a glass of wine. That's what they use, kind of a standard unit. Has some purines that immediately go to uric acid. Some maltose. So here's the maltose. It loses 10% by having to be broken down, and 20% of that is used by the liver. So it's got 10 grams of glucose, 13 grams of liver. What does that look like? The alcohol goes in here, 13, and if it was taken a while, if they had this beer over a couple hours, it probably was a non-event. It simply all got processed into acetate, remember? And it goes out with the urine that gets excreted. If they had 28 cans of beer, obviously a different story. They would clearly exceed the capacity of this particular pathway, and then all go into polyol pathway and intermediates of toxic aldehydes. But we have 13 grams of alcohol, which is probably not on a can-to-can basis, one beer, not a problem, and some sugar, so a lot less, but it has some guanine, which is immediately into uric acid. So alcohol is not everybody's problem. These are the two enzymes that we all have to break down alcohol, from ethanol to acetaldehyde to acetate. Well, if you don't have the ability to do that in either one of these, you're going to have a problem and you're not going to be able to excrete it. So that's a genetic thing. So here's the first enzyme, there's the second enzyme. So if you have a problem at the second enzyme, which a lot of people do, this is now genomically we're talking about, which you can find out about yourself. This particular genetic mutation of not being able to handle alcohol very well is known more for Southeast Asia and Polynesia area. Alcohol dehydrogenase 2, right here, they don't do this part very well. So what happens? They get a backup of acetaldehyde, which makes for toxic aldehyde, which goes into the whole polyol pathway. But even more important, this is a carcinogenic. It makes for a cancer, increase for cancer will go up. If you have a problem with the first one, the alcohol, 100% of the alcohol will go into your system. Notice glutathione is a big player here, and I could have put glutathione in up there as well. Okay, so how do I know, or how do you know if you have alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency? You have a problem with that gene or whatnot, and what would happen? Well, one is if your nose turns red a lot. Some people think, oh yeah, with wine my nose turns red. Well, not so much specific for wine. This is general for alcohol. Other people tend to get this confused with molybdenum deficiency, which is usually a wine-specific issue and a sulfite problem. So it's not that I'm talking about. Generally, those who get hungover very quickly are those who have a problem. And again, it's mostly about Southeast Asia, Pacific Islanders. Symptoms are headaches, dizziness, hypotension, heart palpitations. It's a hangover. Acetaldehyde accumulates in these deficient, as I showed you. Okay, for people who have this deficiency and drink, acetaldehyde can accumulate to toxic levels, to the point that the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies acetaldehyde as a group 1 carcinogen, top carcinogen. It's cancer causing. It's a big deal. And so this is how this looks. Acetaldehyde levels over 50 milliliters are considered toxic and cause mutations in DNA, and that's sort of the nature of cancer, causes mutations. The strongest effects are seen in the mouth. That's where you first start breaking down alcohol, if you didn't know. After 2 or 3 servings of alcohol, which is about this amount of alcohol per body weight, salivary acetaldehyde in deficient people reach over 100 micromilliliters. Compared to normal people, it's under 20. So it's 5 times higher. 5 times higher. Again, Here's the first enzyme, there's the second enzyme, the one we're talking about. And so when you have this blocked, this backs up, makes for toxic aldehydes, makes for a problem, and some of that goes into the polyol pathway. But just one beer, and if you didn't have any problems here, it shouldn't be a problem. So people with this deficiency are 2 to 8 times more likely to develop head and neck cancers, oral, pharyngeal, laryngeal cancers, are 2 to 12 times more likely to develop esophageal cancer. Here's what that genomic report looks like, briefly going over this since I've mentioned this before in this particular video. What we're looking at is this mutation, what they call it ALDH2 asterisk 2, okay? And these are other variations of that, or you can look it down right here, but this is the one we're talking about this most. So this is a person that doesn't have it at all. This is a person who is homozygous for it, so that's a concern. It means they have a problem with processing alcohol. That's a concern. This person does not have a problem. So this person who doesn't have a problem with processing alcohol, what this means here is saying they have a high gout risk, but they have a low cancer risk. That means that the alcohol can be excreted once you expire, once that pathway gets expired, meaning you've already maxed out all the cofactors and everything else, it will go into the polyol pathway, but not build up those toxic acetaldehydes, okay? So you have higher risk of gout, which is a good thing, because we have gout, you have pain, it's like an alarm going off, but you have lower risk of cancer. And so for those who have a problem processing alcohol, and they're the ones that get hungover easy and have all the side effects I've talked about, they have a very high risk of cancer. So many other studies support this as well. Alcohol flushing response for an unrecognized risk factor for esophageal cancer and alcohol consumption, 2009. This particular polymorphism we talked about, and alcohol-related cancers in the Asians, as I mentioned. Which is worse, soda or beer? A 12-ounce comparison, Coca-Cola or beer? It's definitely the soda. And the third phase is the phase we're living in right now of really the last 70 years. But I wanted you to understand that how can I dare, with a history of gout, how can I dare have liver pate, and I love it. And egg yolks is not so much of a grieving food, but putting these together, it makes for a fairly high purine consumption, intermittent. But that's not really my concern. My concerns are the other ones. Phase 2, there's the sucrose. Phase 3 is the alcohol oils. It's the antibiotics. And the last piece of all this, right? The last 70 years is phase 3. So that what came there was the antibiotics, which is in all our food and the animals and so on and so forth. We've talked about that in this video up here. We have high omega-6 because grains from the agricultural revolution became so popular. You had high omega-6, very little omega-3, and the alcohol sugars made for even more, went down the same pathway as fructose, the same pathway as alcohol, and kept on creating more endogenous purines. And so it's an inside job from the alcohol to the fructose, from the sucrose to the additives now in our foods of the antibiotics and the alcohol sugars and the high omega-6. So there's even more to that in this last 70 years. The last part of the last 70 years that is perhaps as critical as everything I've said so far is the deficiencies that we have because of this overnutrition, because of processed foods and everything else. And that is three things that we'll talk about and get into the research later. That is vitamin D deficiency directly elevates uric acid. Omega-3 deficiency directly, and when I say directly omega-3 allows, omega-6 keeps in, when you have high omega-6, it keeps in the uric acid and doesn't allow it to be excreted. Omega-3 does just the opposite. It allows it to be excreted. So it doesn't make purines, it just doesn't allow the purines to be excreted. That is the omega-6. So when we're omega-3 deficiency and omega-6 high, we have a problem. We have a big problem. Vitamin D deficiency, vitamin 6 excess, and the last one is vitamin C. Vitamin C. You go, well, wait a minute, can anybody have vitamin C? I don't see people walking around the streets here with scurvy. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's true. Well, it's low grade, population-wide, cultural, unless those people take vitamin C and they're smart enough to have that. Most people actually don't take very much in the way of fruit. Most people don't take much in the way of supplements that they need. So we have an ongoing vitamin C deficiency. And so vitamin C is another one that basically the deficiency keeps the uric acid from being excreted. So you start adding these things together, it makes perfect sense that we not only have gout, which is a low-level correlation of uric acid, but the biggest concerns for elevated uric acid are the cardiovascular, the cerebrovascular, the Alzheimer's, the dementia. It goes on and on. So fructose is a big key with this. But it's not the only story. If we were just having starches, if we were just having sucrose, that was all our diet, which obviously is not the case for really anybody, that would be a problem. But what has happened and escalated in the last 70 years, and this whole series I've been doing on uric acid is about why do we have so much concern now with the elevated uric acid? Why do we have cognitive decline? Why do we have Alzheimer's screaming off the charts? Why do we have cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, all the other things, and diabetes and obesity, all the other things that are associated? Well, the reason we have that is because we've now piled on the other things that either don't allow us to excrete uric acid or create more purines endogenously by taxing the liver. So there you go. That's the long story of all this. And the pieces need to be sort of put out there and discussed. So I'll get back to my pate, my Paleolithic snack, and talk to you next time. So what I didn't cover here, which is important because I wanted to elaborate on it, perhaps too much, but we'll later, are the big deficiencies associated with hyperuricemia. So that's the vitamin D, the vitamin C, the omega-3, and we'll get into a few other things. And why salt is such a critical factor. It's a really interesting story. Okay, in the meantime, it always comes back to the same thing. The only way to truly know about uric acid for you is to measure it. Are you going to get a meter, or are you going to go to the lab and get that done? Ask your doctor to get it for you. However you get there, get there. This is important. You should monitor it when you're young, middle-aged, older, but this should be part of your growing self-awareness so you can take action on your degree of health. It's pretty straightforward how to change this. But know your levels and really get to know that. You know, don't say, oh, my doctor told me this, my doctor told me that. No, you take responsibility for knowing this. And how you would do that is you can either get a meter, which is what we do. I like this meter because it's glucose, it's ketones, it's uric acid, and it's cholesterol. I'm not that interested in the cholesterol, but all four are possible. So you can use it for any one of those meters. Here's our labs that we did way back, maybe it's a year ago now, basically from blood draw. There's Carl's, there's Judy's, there's the ranges. There's the meter that we use, and there's a link for a discount on this and the details to this particular video, like all my videos actually. And this is what this looks like. I really think it's really cool. You can put this right on your phone and you can print it out however you want to do it. But I would set a time of day to be very consistent across. Is it going to be in the morning? Measure that. Is it going to be in the afternoon? Is it after workout? Learn how that changes with you. Learn about how this is part of your life. That's what you should do. Till next time. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.